Recording is started. Yeah. So let's get back to what we are talking about yesterday. And uh, I have mailed all these slides, including today's slide yesterday also to you. Now, just think about a particular farm paying uh, two particular things. One is it is paying a corporate tax to the government, and second, it is bearing part of the social security tax. Say, for the case of India, it is bearing a part of the provident fund payment. These two things, right? So this one is meant directly for the government, and this one is part of the employee benefit, right? But both are mandatory. Now, two things might happen. As I mentioned, what will a farm do? From a farm's perspective, it is going to maximize its profit. And profit has two components: total revenue, total cost. Now, this cost part has gone up, which is apart from making payments for, say, wages to the labor, rent to the capital, rent to the land, whatever there are, the costs, the variable, the fixed costs, whatever are there. Along with this, these two costs have added to the total cost function of the farm. Now, what can the farm do? It can reorganize its cost structure, so it can reduce the wages a little bit, or it can pass on this increased cost as higher prices. Now, when wages fall, maybe wages does not fall in a totality, but this part which the employer was supposed to pay is also reflected on your total wage, total annual wage. That's why I always request all the students like you, because you're going to join the job market very soon. Always have a good look in your cost company, that breakup. While comparing, suppose you have multiple offers, it's better to have a good look at the CTC. Now, this way or this method or this strategy that a farm employs to pass on, at least partially, some of its tax liability to the employee is what we call the tax has shifted backward. Now, the other strategy that I'm not going to affect the employees, I will somehow pass on this increased cost to the consumers of my output through higher prices of my output. This is what we call shifted forward. Now, these have implications. Take, for example, the tax in the particular sector has gone up. Okay. Now, if the tax goes up on a particular sector, whatever the farm does, that's a different thing. All the farms in that sector will face this higher cost. And in general, as you will see very shortly today, most of the time it is partially shifted. Whether it is shifted forward or backward, this shifting of tax is obviously theoretically complete shifting or full shifting is possible, but in general it is partial. Why, that you will understand very shortly. Now, whatever amount being shifted, first thing is, if I cannot shift it completely, then my profit basically falls, which is profit after tax, net profit after tax, that will come down. So the profitability of that entire sector comes down. So as an investor, investing in that particular sector will become less and less attractive, right? Good, thank you. Now, if investors find that their investment is not realizing a target profit, they will tend to withdraw their capital or their investment from that sector and invest in another sector, right? So, and this happens. Always remember the type of model, microeconomic model, that we tend to employ while analyzing our economic problems. First thing is, we always said that there are different runs: short run, very short run, market run, intermediate run, long run, and that those runs are contingent upon how much changes you can do in your input structure and how flexible is that input structure, right? So if I just cannot do anything with my input and hence my output remains constant, we call it a market or a very short run. And when everything is flexible, we call it a long run. And in between, we have the intermediate run. Simple. Now, that type of argument is no more completely valid in modern world. Can anyone tell me why? Or let me put it in a different way, that not all inputs to production remains uh, follows the behavior as predicted by Alfred Marshall while defining this short run, long run, intermediate. So it's almost like 100 years since Alfred Marshall uh, talked about these different types, or tried to bring in the behavior, real changes that happens over time. The world has changed, and that is why I'm saying that exact Alfred Marshallian type of uh, market structure or the farm behavior not exactly matches in modern day. Now, why? You don't need to be an economist to answer this, right?
So,
Yes.
what exactly did Alfred Marshall say?
Okay, that Alfred Marshall said is exactly what I said. Like, in economy, there can be different runs: short run behavior, medium run behavior, long run behavior. And he said, okay, what is a short run behavior? Suppose in my production, I incorporate capital and labor broadly. So short run is that particular time frame where the farm just cannot alter its use of capital and labor because of you just cannot take, that's what he gave an example, that you just cannot take capital out from or labor out from the agricultural sector and put it into the manufacturing sector overnight. And that is why the supply side remains sticky. So suppose there is a change in demand pattern. You want to enhance or try to, there is a technical change which is there and you need to adopt it in your production structure. So there is a ratio at which you are using, right, capital labor. So overnight it is not possible to change. And that is what we call a short run. Long run, where everything can be that time period within which you can change all the inputs, its ratio, or you might substitute one type of capital with another. So that's what we call long run. And in between, some factors can be replaced, some factors are still sticky. Suppose I want to replace my unskilled labor with skilled labor, so I'm imparting a skill to the labor. So that transformation takes a little time, but I have already shifted the capital structure. So that will be the intermediate run. Very logically, he said that there can be basically short, very short, intermediate, and long run behaviors of firms. And why is it important, Avinav? Look, what is profit maximization? It's the flip side of cost minimization. And when you do a cost minimization technique, you assume that suppose in my production it's a function of labor and capital, then the prices of labor and capital are W and R. And suppose Aij are the coefficients of production, which means take for example AL1. So in industry 1, what is the mid labor units required to produce 1 unit of the output of industry 1? So we call these coefficients, right? So all these AIJs will also are there. At equilibrium, you get some unique values of them when you solve for a general equilibrium structure. Now the question is, what if the suppose one of the prices of the factors of production has gone up? Say the price of capital has gone up. What will you do? You'll try to rework that cost minimization problem by substituting capital by labor, right? Because capital has become costly. So labor has become relatively cheap. You want to substitute labor, you want to substitute capital by labor. So these AIJs will change. So this is what we call change in the technique of production. And to have that, suppose my output requirement remains constant, then how much capital I should employ in totality, not to produce only one. Suppose I have a K1 prime is the new coefficient of capital in my production, which has gone down. I need less capital now to produce 1 unit of the same good because I have substituted capital with some labor. I have changed my technique of production. So what in totality, how much total capital I require? AK1 prime into total units I produce. So that means I have to bring down my capital stock. I have to enhance my labor employment. to support this new technique of production. And everything started because price of capital had gone up. And everything happening parallelly and simultaneously. Now, can I change these things overnight? Alfred Marshall says, no, cannot. And this is exactly why I take a short run. And if you remember from your microeconomics, uh, uh, understand the lectures on cost, there are short run costs and there are long run costs. And the long run average cost is nothing but the envelope of all the short run average costs, right? Using that envelope theorem. And why? And which one you choose? You choose that plant size for whom the long run average cost is the minimum. Now, choosing the plant also takes time. Now, I am saying theoretically these ideas are perfect, but the concept of short run is no more quite applicable to our production structure nowadays. So that's a comment I am making. Why? That was the question.
So modern tech has changed. The capital can be shifted overnight with a bank transfer.
You're correct, but technically you should understand that it's not only bank transfer, the capital that we are using in production structure and the production scenario both are changed. First thing first, whether there is a location to the production that was absent in those classical theories or new classical theories. You always said, or in all microeconomic textbooks that we read, that first thing first, that the entire thing is produced at the same place. Over the last 30 years, this type of production function or production structure has changed significantly because what we call a modular production structure, right? The entire iPhone, the iPhone that you use is not produced in one particular plant. Some part of it are produced somewhere else, part B is produced somewhere else, and everything comes to a particular location, and the entire thing is being assembled in a separate place. And the technologies of production for these different parts of the same good are different. So you cannot have any more say this is the production function of the iPhone. Why? The display is being produced in a different place with a different production function, different coefficients. The audio components, transponders, the microchips, whatever, different place. Assembly line, most probably in China, with a completely different production function. This is the first point. And the second point is we do not see the fixed capital sort of capital structure anymore. The capital that we understand nowadays is financial capital. And as you pointed out, Avinav, you can shift it overnight. So until and unless you have locked in to a particular plant size with a particular stock of labor and capital and some exact technique of production, which uh, I by that I mean that capital to labor ratio, it is very difficult to get the exact, the classical short run in our pictures nowadays. It's either intermediate run or long. Obviously, changing the labor, adding up new labor, changing the labor from skilled to unskilled or unskilled to skilled, replacing the labor by uh, automation, that takes time. So the concept of long run is there, but the concept of very short run is very specific to certain sectors, particularly agricultural sector. It is very difficult to have to remove the concept of short run because output is there. You have taken it to the market. Nothing can be changed. Even if the demand goes up, nothing can be done. Harvest is there, done. So for those very few sectors, the short run exists. But for all other sectors, particularly the manufacturing sector, the concept of short run is a little diluted now. There are debates, obviously, but the concept is quite diluted. Now you can always say, okay, I can think it is an intermediate run. Now, when I bring that back to this last paragraph, why I said all these things? Because it is very important to understand the mechanism of how things happen. Now, when you tax a particular sector, capital will overnight come out of it. And that will happen overnight. Now, if I bring out capital from the corporate sector because corporate tax has gone up, it will move to some other sector, which is what we call the unincorporated sector. Now, there is excess capital in the market. The moment that is there, the return to capital falls. And hence, when I say wages might fall, it is not only labor wages. It can be what I mean wages here, it can be generalized to what we call returns to practice of production. So now you had started with a corporate tax, but now the result is you have taxed capital as a whole. So if wages fall, suppose you maintain profitability through wage cut, labor wages, then capital will not move out, profitability remains same. But you have started with a corporate tax, ended up taxing the employees, the labor working in that corporate sector. And that is why we said that incidence of tax is a very, very important thing. Who bears the final burden of the tax imposed? And this is very crucial. Now remember, we'll bring back those theoretical understandings which we said that which are the desirable characteristics, right? And we started with this thing, fair. A tax should be a fair thing. Now, fairness will be now redefined in this fashion. The whether the tax system is fair or not depends on whom the tax is imposed, but not on who actually pays the tax. So, fairness of the tax system depends on the incidence of tax. So, I said that you impose a corporate tax and the farm reorganizes its profit function and decides, okay, no, let's not penalize the employees or something, but to maintain profitability, increase the price. The moment you do that, you're passing on the burden of the tax to the consumers. Basically, you're shifting the tax forward. If the farm can do that, or if that is the end thing after the imposition of the tax, then this fairness criteria fails. Because the tax was supposed to be imposed on the corporate house, but the incidence of the tax is on the final consumers. And you can understand intuitively that you can have two different types of tax systems. You can impose both on these corporate houses, but in a different design, you can have different results. So, and also the flip side is also there. And this is exactly what we call the Ricardian equivalence. And we'll study that. The two taxes which look completely different from each other, but have the same end result. So we call it equivalence. Take, for example, the government of India would have increased the income tax of the salaried people so as to collect some fund to fight the COVID pandemic. What would have happened? We would have paid the taxes, our budget, our disposable income should have come down, our budget line should have shifted downwards, right? On the other hand, what the government might have could have done is to impose higher prices on of petrol through higher taxes in petroleum. There also the real income falls. There are differences, obviously there are differences. One, the first difference is in the first case, only my budget line shifts laterally downwards without changing its slope. On the other hand, when I increase the price of petrol, I am pivoting the budget line. So those who does not purchase petrol will not have any impact on their budget line. But for all the people for whom their consumption basket has some amount of petroleum, their budget line will pivot. So the slope will change. Relative prices will change. One is pure income effect, other is income effect and substitution. Second important thing is income tax will be applicable only to salaried people, and this tax on petrol will be having impact on almost everyone. Differences are there. But look, the, these things, the target were initially with income tax, the target was the salary people. Then they came. So incidence of tax and the legal uh, the particular cohort who are legally supposed to pay the tax remains the same. Petroleum meant for people who are using petrol. It's the incidence is also there. Reduction of disposable income, both cases, both cases. So these two taxes, they look quite different from each other. But at the end, yes, Sagar, Sagar, you wanted to say something?
No, sir,
No,
I
sir, I
accidentally turned it on.
accidentally did not. Okay, okay, no problem. So now, uh, these taxes behave, the end results behave in the same way, but the design are quite completely different. Take for example, I think all of you must have done international economics a little bit, particularly the HS students. Yes or no?
So,
Yes. Hmm?
no, sir.
International economics, in which semester is that?
I have to check. I have to check that, sir. We haven't done that till now.
Okay, no problem. You must have done equilibrium analysis in microeconomics, existence, uniqueness, stability of an equilibrium, right? The Walrasian approach, the Marshallian approach
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
to equilibrium,
Yes.
right? That you have done. Now look, suppose you have a demand curve and a supply curve, a downward sloping demand curve linear, upward sloping supply curve linear. They're intersecting or having an equilibrium. Somehow you want to achieve a different price quantity combination. What is an equilibrium? Equilibrium is nothing but a combination of price and quantity, right? It's a point in that space. It's a particular coordinate. You want to achieve another coordinate. There are two ways you can achieve it. One, you change the price, the quantity will automatically adjust. This is the Walrasian approach. Other approach is you do not tamper with the price, you just block the quantity at a particular value. The price will automatically adjust and come back to the same point. And this is a Marshallian approach. So when countries trading with each other impose tariff, we see, no? Very recently we have seen such a hullabulla on that US-China trade war, everything, right? They keep on imposing tariff for different reasons. Countries do impose tariff. Basically, they're tweaking with the price. So that's the Walrasian approach. What you might know, might also not know, because you have not yet been exposed to that international economics course, you'll find there is something called a quota. That this year, India will import only 20,000 units of dishwashers and not more. Not tampering with the price, but with the quantity. The Marshallian approach. End result, both same. One is a tariff or a tax directly impacting the price. The other one is a quota, tweaking with the quantity, but having the same implicit tariff. End result, same. This is what we call Ricardian equivalence. Similarly, in cases of taxes, other taxes, you can also find Ricardian equivalence. Transparency. This is again, look, it's quite, everyone will say, yeah, I agree, I agree. So, what is transparency? Again, we should define it in terms of incidence. A tax system is transparent if the incidence of that tax is clear. Everyone can understand the incidence of the tax. So, you have to impose tax in such a way that the apparent incidence of tax, like the corporate tax, apparently you think the farms pay it. But as you found out, it can be the employees, it can be the final consumer, so they can pass on. Simple. So the tax design should be such that this apparent incidence and the actual incidence, they coincide. Now, incidence of tax itself has few determinants. First thing first is the market structure of the economy. To boil it down, whether it's competitive or it's imperfectly competitive. Right? If it is competitive, think of a corporate tax. All the firms in that industry are competitive, facing perfect competition. None of them would take the risk of increasing the price or shifting the tax forward. But if it takes a monopoly, it will definitely do. In an oligopoly, they might well do. In a cartel, they will definitely do. So, the market structure, the structure of that industry, that depends. That is quite important to understand the actual incidence of tax. Now, even if the market is competitive, then also there is a catch, and that is the shape of the demand and supply curves. It is of no difference, as we'll see, just with a very simple diagram, we'll see that there is no difference whether the tax was actually designed to be imposed on the manufacturer or the buyer of the commodity. If the particular shape of the demand and supply curves are there, then even if it was a consumer commodity, consumer tonnage, it should be a tax on the commodity the consumer is supposed to pay. But it's the producer will end up paying it, and vice versa. How? Okay, just look, we're talking about a perfectly competitive farm level, P equal to MC. given by the market structure, tax imposed. So effective cost will be increased by the amount of tax. And it is true for each and every farm. Now, what is the market supply curve? The aggregate supply, the total amount that all farms willing to supply at each price. Now suppose T is the tax rate. If, then let's look into this upper left panel. Perfectly competitive market structure. I'm talking about one farm. So the farm's output, the price is a price taker, say P naught. Even if the tax is imposed and whatever, it just cannot have any say on the pricing of the output. So initially, this was your supply curve. So at P naught, you were supposed to provide Q naught. So remember, what is the demand curve that each farm in a perfectly competitive market faces? It's an infinitely elastic demand curve, right? And that's exactly given by this horizontal black line from P naught, because P naught is the price. Now tax is imposed, so marginal cost now becomes MC plus T. But at that price I cannot change. So what will happen? My supply will come backward. And look, the vertical distance between the old and the new supply curve is exactly the tax rate, the tax rate. So with new tax structure, price remaining P naught, you just end up supplying Q naught price. Now aggregating across all the farms. Now, what is the difference between this picture and this picture? The difference is very simple. The difference is this one, a farm, a price taking farm. Its assumption is whatever I supply is not going to affect the price. So the demand curve that I face is a horizontal one, infinitely elastic. Now the question is, in reality, what is happening? You have a downward slope demand curve. Now, when the farm says at this new tax structure, my production will shift from Q naught to Q naught prime. That will happen for all the n number of farms. And that is exactly captured in this down right panel. Now look, initially we started with P naught and Q naught. If I wanted to keep Q naught as the price, I should have increased the price from P naught to P naught plus T. But now, with so initially it was, let me put a color, then it is visible. Forget about this. So initially, I was producing Q naught, everyone producing Q naught. So summation Q naught, which is N into Q naught, becomes capital Q naught. And price P naught, P naught. Now the tax has been imposed. And there has been changes in the supply structure of each and every farm. Aggregate, which is captured through a upward shift of the supply curve, right? Now, if I wanted to keep the original output, I should have increased the price from P0 to P0 plus T. Now, with a different thing at the aggregate, this becomes my when the price now look the price when each farm thinks that I cannot affect the price and hence my reduction from Q0 to Q0 prime will have zero impact on price. They're making a mistake, but they cannot help. All of them, when they behave in the same way from Q0 to Q0 prime, aggregate supply in the market comes down. With demand unchanged, prices will shoot up. So even when I am unable to change the price myself when I move from Q0 to Q0 prime, together we actually make a difference. And what happens to the price then? Goes up. Not necessarily by the entire amount P0 plus T. So in this case, as you can see, had the price been gone up to P0 plus T, then it is the consumer who is bearing the entire burden of the tax. The farms have shifted it forward. If the price remained at P0, then the entire tax was being taken care of by the farms. The consumers do not feel. But in this case, as you can see, the equilibrium price will be somewhere between P0 and P0 plus T. Maybe P0 plus half T. Which means both the farm and the final consumer bear some burden of the tax. And as I can see, just only from this graph, it is not possible to say who is bearing how much. So the incidence of the tax is not exactly clear. What we can see, both are bearing some. So just have a look to in this example. So there is this beer and there is a 10 cents. The tax on each producer 10 cents per bottle. Just like this, the supply curve should shift upward. And the price will rise. Now, as you can see, it can be somewhere in between. And let's assume it's has gone up, the final price has gone up by 5%. Though the initial tax was say 10%. Okay. Now you can completely understand that how much each of them are receiving. So the equilibrium price is started with $1 a bottle and ended up with a 10-cent per bottle additional tax. The total price goes up to 1.05. So 5 cents being borne by the consumers and obviously the other 5 by the producers. And graphically, you can see this is absolutely simple. Now, suppose now, if you impose this 10 cents on the MRP, so you increase 10 cents per can of beer. So you're making it directly as a tax which is to be borne by the consumers. But look, in that case, you get the same result. Initially, you start with P0, increase the price from P0 to P1 plus T, demand curve shifts, new equilibrium comes, and that is exactly the same story. Now, whether you impose it on producer or consumer, depending on the market structure and the shape and size of the demand and supply curve, you can calculate out who will bear how much of the burden of the tax, right? Not only that, it also does not matter whether you impose the tax as a percentage of the price. This is exactly what we call the ad valorem tax. Or you put a specific tax which is tax per unit of output. And this one, you'll find, is exactly what I meant when I said about Marshallian adjustment or Walrasian adjustment. Suppose you start with the ad valorem tax. Now, what is ad valorem tax? The tax is levied as a percentage of price. Suppose you start with E0. You have a supply curve, you have a demand curve, you have E0. Now, the moment you increase the price by increase the tax as a change in the per unit price. So what will happen? There will be a pivot. So when price is 0, quantity demanded was D1. And when price is D0, quantity demanded was 0. Now I'm saying suppose 5% on the price. When price is 0, 5% of price is again 0. So only at D1, the demand curve will coincide with the old one. But for any positive price, you will have prices going up, and hence following the demand of law, there will be lower and lower demand. And that is why when you add the ad valorem tax, the demand curve changes from D0 D1 to D1 D1, pivoting around the D1 on the horizontal axis. Now you impose specific tax. What is specific tax? Tax per quantity. What will happen to your demand curve? Basically, you are taking away, suppose for all the prices, what is the demand curve? what is the maximum I am willing to pay for each and every quantity. Now look at it from the other prism. What is the quantity that I will get if I want to pay this much? And that is why I had the D0 D1 initial demand curve. Now the government is saying you have to pay a tax per unit of it. So it boils down to me, for the same price, I'll get a quantity which is a little lesser. So I'm getting the same quantity, but I have to give a transfer some quantity to the government. So what will happen? It will shift laterally down. And now you have D2 D2 as a new demand curve following the specific tax. The answer is does not make any difference. As long as you do not change the supply curve, E1 will become your new equilibrium, even with specific tax or ad valorem tax. Why? Why exactly D1 D1 and D2 D2 intersect the supply curve at E1? The answer lies when I explained the Walrasian and Marshalling. Just look at this picture. Forget about tax and everything. Whether you want to increase, you start with an equilibrium E naught, which is nothing but a combination of P naught and Q naught. You want to achieve a new price, say Q1 and new price P1 plus T. You can do one thing. You can go the Walrasian approach. From E naught, increase the price. Ad hoc increase the price to P1 plus T without any change. From P naught, shift it upward. What will happen? What is the equilibrium quantity? The equilibrium quantity transacted is the minimum of quantity demanded and quantity supplied at that price by definition. Obviously then, at P1 plus T, producer would like to supply this much, consumers will demand this much. Minimum is the quantity demanded, and hence you will get Q1. You don't have to do anything in the quantity. Just change the price from P0 to P1 plus T, you'll get Q1. The Marshallian approach, I just don't want to change the price. Sometimes changing the price by a government or something has political repercussions. Don't change the price. Just fix that Q1 is the quota. So at Q1, which one will be the market clearing price? Again, P1 plus T. So whether you fix P1 plus T or you fix Q1, either way, you'll get the same P1 plus T Q1 combination. And these are the two types of adjustments possible, either through price or through quantity. Whichever you do, you get the same P1. Okay. Now, sometimes in practice, there are taxes which differ because of the quality of the good. Why these taxes differ? Because sometimes, take for example, you want to correct something. So there are two types of cigarettes. Say one uses a new uh, what I can say, a filter which reduces both inhaling and exhaling of uh, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and whatnot. Right? A new type of filter. The other one goes with the second one, original one, the old type of filter. Now, what will happen? The new improved quality is supposed to create less pollution, less health hazard. So tax should be less. The old one should remain with the old high tax rate. But most of the time, it is very difficult for the government to check the quality of the filter and to exactly understand how much damage control is this new filter doing. So whatever the filter is, the specific tax remains there. So impose a specific tax. If you consume one packet, this much tax you have to pay. You consume two packets, you have to pay twice the amount. Simple. So the tax is fixed per unit, right? Look, when I am unable to determine the quality, what is my tax percentage of the commodity? For the low value product, because what is the tax structure? Pay, say, 30% of the MRP per unit or per packet of a cigarette. So suppose one is 100 rupee, another is 120 rupees, but the 120 rupees is of much better quality. So the tax is a higher percentage of the price. You pay what? You pay not on MRP, that would have been ad valorem. Now you're paying specific tax. So if you want to purchase one packet, you pay 30 rupees. You pay one to buy two packets, pay 60 rupees. Now, look, one is a low quality packet and another is a high quality packet. With a low quality, the 30 is a higher share of the price as vis-a-vis the high quality. So the specific tax has a fault that it discriminates the low quality goods more. But it is very easy to monitor how much you have produced, particularly when I'm talking about a multi-commodity Indian Tobacco Company, ITC. It not only produce 100 kinds of cigarettes and whatever, it also produce biscuits to the Sunfist or something of that sort. It also produce ITC notebooks, that paper notebooks. So when you are talking about a multi-commodity firm, it is very difficult for the government to keep a tab on the periodic prices charges, right? Now the question is, it is easier to monitor how much quantity they have produced and sold. And hence, it is better, it is easier for the government to go for a specific tax, which is tax per unit. Now, suppose this tax, this instead of specific tax, they have an ad valorem tax. Now, if the ad valorem tax was there, look, there's an incentive by the farm on behalf of the farm, such that the high taxed commodity is underpriced on sale and bill. So that's how, look, it's not only about incidents, it's also about compliance. How easy it is it for the government to monitor that the taxpayee is compliant? And hence, if I impose tax on per unit, I understand there is a problem that in fact the low quality goods will be suffering as compared to the high quality goods. But if I revise that tax structure from output tax to tax on the price, so ad valorem is the percentage on your unit price. High quality means high price. So suppose there is a 100 rupee packet and there is a 200 rupee packet. Now you are saying, I'm not interested in a quantity. I am just want to have 30% of the MRP. You adjust the MRP such that I have 30% over the price that you would have quoted in absence of tax. So the 130, the 100 rupee packet will become 130. The 200 rupee packet will become 260. Right? So you pay 30 rupees on the low quality, 60 rupees on the high quality. But what if I can underreport or underprice the high quality good just to avoid the tax? So instead of 200, I just make it 150. So instead of 60, now I'm paying 45. Now, whether I am paying or not, whether I want to shift it to the consumer also, that's another thing. I'm not bringing that question so here. I'll bring that question a little later. In either way, there are problems. Now, as I said, whether that incidence will be of the specific tax or ad valorem tax, and we have seen the exact, if I have the same quality of the good, no problem. I'll have the same post-tax equilibrium, irrespective of the type of the or nature of the tax. But now the question is the incidence. As we say, as we have seen so far, that it has been shared between the producer and the consumer. But what if you have demand and supply curves like this? Infinitely elastic supply curve and a normal demand curve, elastic demand curve. Look, the entire, who is paying the tax now?
Sir, I had a doubt.
Yes, please go ahead.
Sir, GST is an ad valorem tax, right?
Yes.
So the government is going for ad valorem tax only at the end.
Basically, GST has one more part of it. It incorporates the modular production structure. And that's why we call it a value added tax. And we'll see that. By the Not end of today, but by the end of next 4 lectures, we are left with the next week. We'll see. We can incorporate the different stages of production. And there is one more thing. So far, we have not brought in the welfare part of tax or the efficiency part of tax. So far, I'm just talking about the incidence of the tax. What about whether this tax is efficient enough or not? The question is the moment I have, and obviously I did not ask, but you can see, the moment you have a picture like this from E0 to this say E1, what will happen? There will be deadweight loss. The moment there is deadweight loss, this triangle will be the two triangles of deadweight loss. The moment you impose the tax, right? The moment you impose the tax, price increases from P0 to say P1 plus T, quantity falls from Q0 to Q1, where this much becomes a producer surplus, this much remains your consumer surplus, this part will become the government revenue. And these triangles, they'll be lost. So deadweight loss. The efficiency part we have not brought in. The moment we integrate the efficiency part, we'll find things changes. There is not only one thing that we have to think about. So far, we talked about fairness, right? Fairness as well as sub clause within fairness as transparency. So basically, we are still in the domain of equity. We have not brought in efficiency. We'll bring in efficiency and see how it will be designed. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Uh, Now the second thing is look at this particular graph on the front of you. We're talking about only incidence of tax rate. We impose a tax, price shoots from P0 to P1, Q0 to Q1, quantity decreases, equilibrium changes from uh, this unknown point, unnamed point to E1. And you can see the vertical distance is the tax you pay. Who bears? The consumer. Who bears? So now we want to incorporate what we're doing, what we're playing with. Play with elasticities of the demand and supply curve. So when I have more inelasticity, look at this demand curve, completely inelastic. So if the demand curve is inelastic, it will be borne by the consumers. Both cases. Here also, what is the flip side here? Here I can understand. I have an inelastic demand. Whatever the price, I'll buy in this quantity. That's the idea, right? Same is the case with petrol. Very inelastic demand. Not necessarily a vertical line, but almost a vertical line. And that is why it's easy to put taxes on petroleum or necessary goods. You cannot just reduce the consumption of it. So when talking about completely inelastic demand or completely elastic or an infinitely elastic supply curve, in either case, the incidence will be on the consumers. You just have an opposite thing. Put a horizontal demand curve and a normal supply curve. Completely elastic. Just look at the picture like this one. Suppose this was the case. Forget about the right hand panel. Suppose this is your industry. Or let's think that this downward sloping demand curve is no more downward sloping, but something of this sort. Complete infinitely elastic demand curve. Then whatever you give me, I don't mind. I'll only pay peanut at equilibrium. So the entire tax has to be borne by the producer. So either I am inelastic or you are infinitely elastic. In both the cases, I have to share the entire burden of the tax. So suppose I am dealing with a very short run, and instead this is not a demand curve, but this is a supply curve, and you have demand curves like this. Okay, let's assume. Let's assume this is your demand curve. And it's an absolutely complete short run. So you have a vertical, completely inelastic supply curve. Then what happens? The entire burden of tax has to be taken by the producer, not the consumer. Or suppose you have a normal supply curve, but a completely infinitely elastic demand curve. What happened? Hmm. Infinitely elastic demand curve you can have. In both these cases, it is the producer who has to take care of the burden of the tax. Now, this is what we have said. Now, now we bring in an interesting part, the tax and the labor demand supply. So you just need to have a new tax on labor. So whether you tax the employer such that the employer takes away some part from the payment, or you directly tax the labor, the incidence is remaining the same. So basically the example that we give is the social security tax. Take for example, in Norway, Denmark, which country? Denmark. Almost 50% is your direct income tax. In fact, on almost of these Scandinavian countries, the income tax is very, very high. But they don't have to pay any other social security tax. In India, we have to pay both, but the income tax is lower. But we do have a social security part. In fact, just give me a second. In fact, 10% on an average. Yeah, on an average, 10% we pay. 10 to 12%. So if I club the 30% income tax and this 10 to 12% social security tax, it's almost 42%. Forget about the indirect taxes. Now, when we talk about the social security tax, And in fact, I'll request all of you to have a look into any textbook on labor economics to have in-depth idea about the concept of this. And there's a nice book, very simply written book, in fact. Very simple book. I forgot the first name of the author, Boreas. Okay, it's a very nice book. So have a look if you want. No, but this is not mandated. This is addition to understand the impact of tax on labor supply. Now, just like commodity tax, which we have seen so far, effectively, whether the labor himself or the employee or employer, who bears the burden of the tax, that depends on the demand and supply of labor. Now, take for example, most of the time, the labor supply is inelastic. Take for example, if you go by the ILO norms, it's 8 hours a day and 5 days a week. So 40 hours a week. That's the ILO norms, International Labour Organization. Now, if that is the case, if I know that I'll work for 40 hours a week, then how the amount of labor I supply is not exactly contingent with the wage I get. Now, here there is a fallacy, but I need to clear that fallacy as well. What is a labor supply curve? The amount of labor that I should supply for the different wages I get. But now I'm saying it's inelastic. I have a vertical labor supply curve, which means irrespective of the wage I get, I supply the same labor. Why? Because most of the time, when we depict the inelastic labor supply curve, we're trying to talk about a simple phenomenon. The moment I enter a job market, I know I have to give in, say, 40 hours a week. And the wage is negotiated before I join. So I have accepted these 40 hours basically at looking at the wage or somehow back calculating the labor demand curve. Because the intersection of the labor demand curve and the labor supply curve gives me my wage rate, right? So basically what I have done, I have not started with a labor demand curve and a labor supply curve and gone through the interaction and getting the wage rate. Rather, I have seen the labor demand curve and negotiated a wage rate such that I give the 40 hours a week. Again, the price and quantity adjustments too. Whether the Walrasian approach, here we are taking the Marshallian approach. So, okay, so there is no confusion, there is no paradox. In fact, the Marshallian approach to labor market is quite acceptable. Now, if my labor supply curve is vertical, that means I should bear the entire burden of the tax. So it does not matter whether the government directs the labor or the workers or the employers, the farms, to impose the social security tax. Suppose it is not inelastic, it is elastic. So there is a positive one-to-one correspondence between wage and labor. Suppose we are in the informal sector where more number of hours I work, more wage I get. We are in that zone. Now what will happen? We impose a tax. The moment you impose a tax, the demand curve for labor will shift downward. And as you can see, that the tax will be shared among both employer and employee. But at equilibrium, employment will shrink and wage rates will also shrink a little bit. Why wage rate shrinking means? That's the amount of the burden of the tax or the proportion of the burden of the tax which is being borne by the workers. Now let's go back to the classic backward bending part. In the backward bending part of the labor supply curve, the labor supply curve is more and more inelastic. But here, the change in wage will be more than in the elastic portion. So, if you impose the tax on, say, land is fixed. It cannot be increased, cannot be decreased. It will be bearing the entire burden of the tax. Now, when you can incorporate this idea to the date in terms of capital given by big countries or developed countries to developing countries. Now, look at the Chinese debt and the Sri Lankan economy. Try to answer from his perspective. No. Suppose, as we talked about this financial capital, it's completely mobile across the globe. And you have a world market rate of return. So the supply of capital is infinitely elastic. The moment you impose tax on that foreign capital, it is the receiving country who is going to bear the entire burden of that tax. Right? Same thing. So we talked about tax on commodity, talked about tax on labor. Now we are talking a little bit on the tax on capital.
So I didn't understand change in wage part. Like, why is that portion change in wage?
Which one?
So in this
Okay,
graph,
look. Okay, fine. Let me get that. Let me try to do one thing. Is the entire picture visible to you? I've shifted the
Yes,
graph.
sir. It's visible.
So both the panels visible now.
Yes, sir.
You impose a tax. Look at the left hand side. We're talking about the elastic portion of the labor supply curve. You impose the same tax rate, okay? Of which some will be borne by the employer, some will be borne by the employee. And when you say change in wage, that is basically the amount of tax part which is being borne by the employee. Now, with lower wage in the elastic portion, you will have lower supply, and hence the employment shrinks. You keep the same amount of tax. Look, and these two, the demand curve does not change much more. Same gap, okay? So demand for labor, it does not change much from the picture this. In this picture, they are the same. So the tax amount remains the same in which you can capture. Now, because of this backward bending portion of it, elastic portion of it, what is happening here? Why is the labor supply backward bending? Because after this point of inflection, what is happening to the labor supply curve? The labor supply curve is depicting a simple phenomenon that the wage rate, suppose you have a wage rate here, right? Let's assume this is the point of inflection. Okay. Now, which depicts a particular wage rate given by this red horizontal line. So this we assume is a very high wage rate. Why? After this wage rate, what is the decision basically when we talk about the labor market? Unlike capital market, there is one more thing. Because the labor supply decision is not only contingent upon the wage that a labor gets, but also the disutility a labor gets while working, because the opportunity cost is if I do not work, I'll have leisure, which will give me my utility. So a wage rate as high as this one indicates a threshold after which the labor or the employee will think that you have to provide me super high wages for me to work, because now this leisure effect has dominated the earning effect. Now look, if the wage is so high, what will happen? I'm getting lower wages, but employment increases. Because at this part, from this point of inflection to this part until it becomes vertical, because at this wage rate onward, it becomes vertical. So I will not change my amount of labor, whatever the wage goes up. But from here, this point to this point of inflection, look, if wage falls, then I increase the quantity of labor. And because it is inelastic, the change in wage will be much higher because of two things. One, the tax portion. Not only the employee is bearing the almost the entire tax part, also because of the particular unique shape of the supply of labor curve in this zone. So the total change in wage is almost double than the tax rate. Here, the change in wage was just half the tax rate. And it is very specific about the shape of the labor supply curve. Clear?
Okay, sir.
Ah. Now, we'll not move forward much today. We have already had like 1 hour, 45 minutes here. So we have so far talked about the incidence of tax on commodity, connection to elasticity, tax on labor, which is quite different from tax on capital. Now look, these are the features we need to look for when we are talking about the tax structure. If I'm looking at the tax on a commodity, I need to understand the market structure first. After the market structure is determined, I need to look at the elasticity of the demand and supply curves. And then we can say, if a tax of that sort is imposed, then who will bear the more burden of it? When we talk about income tax and labor market, it is contingent upon which part of the labor supply curve we are in. Because the labor supply curve has a unique shape. It has a backward bending part and then a vertical part. Because of the leisure labor trade-off of this employee. But when it comes to capital and taxing the capital, we know we're dealing with mostly financial capital, which is mobile across the globe. So the rate of return to the capital is almost standardized across the globe. Then you have a horizontal or infinitely elastic supply curve. So here you can have a normal demand curve for capital, but the supply curve is a horizontal one. And hence the burden of the tax, this will be the consumer of the capital. So in this case, when we talk about capital to be sent, maybe in terms of foreign aid or FDI from a developing to an underdeveloped country, large to a small country, now you know who bears the entire burden of the tax. So we will stop here today. And I have already shared. So there are under 10 slides more. Okay. Because that non-profit competition, that will start from our next lecture. And it will take an hour or so to complete this non-profit competition part. And I think it's well sorted now because we have, after today is 29th, so we have formally 2 lectures next week, which is 3rd November, Wednesday, where we'll complete this non-profit competition part. And then we have Friday 2 hours, because Thursday Diwali is holiday. So Friday 2 hours, there we'll talk about a little bit on the Indian tax system. And then next week, we have 2 lectures, 10th and 11th, followed by 12th, which is the presentation. So I think we are exactly on theme. Okay, so let me stop here. And open to questions if any.
So in the case of imposition on consumers, a
Right.
part of the burden is borne by the laborers and another part is borne by the company. The consumers are not affected.
Sorry, I did not get. Can you give me a specific example?
Oh, so like in the first case wherein you showed that the tax was imposed on the producer, that is per unit of
Okay.
good.
Right. So let me reshare the slides. Sorry that I closed it. This one, right?
Yes, sir. Sir, in this you told that that 0.95 to 1, that much is borne by the consumers, and 1 to 1.05, that would be borne by the firms.
Yeah. Suppose $1 was the pre-tax price of this commodity. Okay. Now, post-tax, whom are you imposing the tax? We assume that the tax is producer 10 cents per bottle. You impose. What will be the result? Supply curve will shift here. So Q0 to Q1. E1 will be the new equilibrium. New price will be 1.05, which means the consumer who were paying $1 prior now are paying 1.05. So the rest, what is the rest? Look at Q1. Before tax, Q1 was getting, for supplying Q1, he was getting $1, right? The supplier. Now, with the new supply curve at Q1, he would have get, using the old one, he would have got 0.95 cents. So basically, out of these 10 cents, which is being taxed on him, he can pass on or shift forward only 5 cents to the consumers. And why are we getting these results? Exactly 5 and 5% each or half each? Because look, we have deliberately drawn the demand and supply curves almost at 90 angles, 90-degree angles at each other. So it's like a 45-degree slope. Here also you have a 45-degree slope, right? That's why we are getting this sort of a symmetric result. Now the question is, instead of that, instead of imposing 10 cents on the country, on the producer, because if you impose on the producer, the supply curve will shift, demand curve will remain unaffected. But knowingly, unknowingly, the consumer will bear 50% of the tax. The question is, will the picture change if I impose the tax not on the producer but on the consumers? And you are saying it will not. It will not. Basically, now you have a change in the demand curve such that the consumers would pay 95 cents to the government, 95% to the producers, and 10 cents to the government through a downshift in the demand curve. So all makes the same. Whether you go for a quantity adjustment or a price adjustment or through shifting the demand curve or shifting the supply curve, whom on you import, the producer or a supplier, producer, supplier, or a consumer, does not make any difference as long as we are in the domain of perfect competition and the shape of this supply and demand curves do not change. Now, why are we getting a 50-50 breakup here? I mentioned we are approximately drawn the demand and supply curve as 45-degree angles. Here, always remember, so far in our analysis, until and unless we go into that domain of value added tax, we are assuming it is the producer who is the seller. Okay. So there is not a difference between a producer and a seller. In real life, what do you have? Production is done by someone, sale is done by a wholesale, followed by a retail, and then a consumer. So there are different layers. So far here, we have clubbed all the three from the supply side together. Producer and the seller at the same time. Okay.
So, but here the final equilibrium point is giving price P1, which is lower than what it was before.
Yes. But what you are doing, this is exactly the 95 cents you are paying to the producer. And the MRP is P1 plus T. So this entire P1 plus T minus P1, which is T, you're paying to the government.
Okay, sir.
At the end of the day, look, as a consumer, when you purchase the good, you are paying P1 or P1 plus T without knowing that your actual demand curve is here and the supplier is getting P1. Analogically, you can have a new demand curve because there is a tax. So the your disposable income has gone down, and so you demand less, but you have to pay this tax. So you're intrinsically paying P1 to the seller and T to the government, but of which the seller would also take a share because it's it will get back to the same numbers. If you go back to the functional form, suppose you have some A plus twice Q, or rather Q equal to A plus twice P, and Q equal to A minus twice P, sort of a 45 degree sort of demand and supply curves. When they interact, you find that these are very simple, the equilibrium. The moment you enter 10% change, at the end of the day, 5% of it will be borne by the consumers, 5% by the sellers. These will change if the elasticities change. Suppose you are a consumer, your demand is completely inelastic, or my supply is infinitely elastic. Now, whomever the tax is intended for, you are going to pay the tax. So the incidence is crystal clear when we have unique cases like either infinitely elastic or infinitely inelastic demand or supply curves. Only one you need, either this one, supply curve flat, supply curve vertical, demand curve flat or demand curve vertical. In either case, we exactly know who's going to get. Anything in between, when you have positively sloped demand curve and a negatively sloped negatively sloped demand curve and a positively sloped supply curve, both will share some of it. And suppose you have a more elastic supply curve and a less elastic demand curve, obviously the burden will be more on the consumer. So there is a one-to-one correspondence between elasticity and the incidence or the burden or the share of the burden. Okay.
Okay, sir.
So any further questions?